Welcome to Season 2 of Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I'm Joshua Sharfstein, Vice Dean for Public Health Practice and Community Engagement, and a former Secretary of Maryland's Health Department. Our goal is to bring scientific evidence and experience to the public health news of the day through informative interviews with scientists, community leaders, policy experts, public health officials, clinicians, and more. If you have ideas or questions for us to cover, please email us at publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Today, Colleen Barry, Chair of the Department of Health Policy and Management at Johns Hopkins, talks with Brendan Nehan, a professor of political science at Dartmouth and an expert on the politics of misinformation. Back in April, they discussed the issue of misinformation about COVID-19 on our podcast. Now they return to this topic and also discuss concerns about misinformation related to the 2020 election. Let's listen.
Brendan, welcome back to the podcast. You are an expert on misinformation, health, and politics. Back in April, we spoke at length about the then emerging challenge that misinformation about COVID-19 posed for combating the pandemic. We are now in the fall of 2020 with no immediate end to the virus in sight. What have we learned about misinformation on COVID-19?
Well, like the virus, it's hard to eradicate. It's a key part of the public health challenge that we currently face. I guess I've been surprised by two aspects of the misinformation problem. The first is how quickly we have to worry about misinformation around potential COVID vaccines and treatments as well. So even things that we might think would operate within the domain of consensus have become politicized, and misinformation is already circulating. So it's not just about the virus and how it spreads, but treatment and potentially vaccines are already and almost immediately became targets for misinformation. So I think that's an ongoing challenge, especially because the science is changing so quickly, and that creates opportunities to confuse people or to make claims about how a change in scientific knowledge means that actually there's some sort of a cover-up or something nefarious going on. The second big challenge that I think I didn't fully anticipate, and I should have given past history, was the extent to which elites would amplify misinformation about the virus and the response to it. Most notably the president, but many other politicians, particularly among the president's allies. You would think it would be in their interest to try to encourage people to protect themselves. An incumbent who wants re-election should be encouraging the behaviors that reduce the virus's spread and severity in the hopes of being re-elected. That's how the incentives are supposed to work. That hasn't happened. It's a puzzle, and it's meant that there's an ongoing public health communications challenge where public health leaders are being contradicted directly by the President of the United States, by governors, by other officials in a way that creates very difficult challenges and really, I think, reasonably confuses people who are hearing these conflicting messages.
So what are the most effective strategies for combating misinformation about the coronavirus?
Well, unfortunately, there's no perfect set of solutions out there. There's no playbook that tells us here's how to get rid of misinformation. I think we're doing better, in part because we know more about the virus and how it spreads and how to respond to it. So the public health guidance is changing less rapidly. I think now that there's been a clear and consistent message for several months or more on the importance of masks and social distancing, those messages are coming through more clearly. There will always be people promoting false cures. I think the strategies around combating misinformation on the platforms have seemed to have been reasonably effective, although it's hard to assess from the outside how effective their interventions have been. And I think the media are doing a better job at reinforcing the science, again, as we've learned more as time has gone on.
So I want to pick up one thread there. Have social media companies been able to get control of their platforms when it comes to misinformation related to the pandemic? Are they getting an A or are they getting an F? Where are we?
It's hard to assess what the platforms do, in part because we can't see what effects their interventions have directly. It's very difficult to assess what would have happened if a platform hadn't put a warning label on a tweet or removed a post from Facebook. Those are the kinds of questions we'd like to know the answer to. It does seem that the platform companies have been more aggressive. They've categorized COVID misinformation as a type of content that is particularly harmful and one that they're therefore going to enforce against more aggressively than they would for other kinds of misinformation. I think that's a reasonable decision given that we're in a pandemic that's killed more than 200,000 Americans and more than 1 million people worldwide. But it does come with challenges. The platforms have to strike a balance between their role as information providers who allow for open debate and their responsibilities as companies that may be amplifying harmful information. So there's an ongoing challenge there. And in all of these cases, the platforms are struggling to keep up with just the volume of information on that they're supposed to be moderating, almost beyond human comprehension. So I think they seem, relative to other areas of misinformation, I think they're doing okay, but we can certainly point to areas where the platforms have failed. And it's an important part of civil society's responsibility and the media to hold them accountable when they do.
So, of course, we're grappling with misinformation on multiple fronts right now. I want to segue to the election. We now have coronavirus misinformation, election-related misinformation, and the confluence of the two. On the election side, one important area where we've seen accusations of misinformation is on the issue of mail-in voting.
That's right. There's an ongoing campaign to falsely claim that voting by mail is not secure, that it's vulnerable to widespread fraud, et cetera. These claims are false. Widespread voter fraud is a fiction. The president, most notably, has been repeatedly claiming that the integrity of the election is threatened by widespread fraud, including fraud committed by via mail voting. There's just no evidence for this. This is completely false. And it's important to note that it is, in part, a function of the pandemic, as your question suggests. The threat of COVID makes in-person voting potentially risky, especially to people in vulnerable groups. They may wish to cast their ballots by mail. Now that the integrity of voting by mail is under question, people feel pressure to vote in person so that the legitimacy of the election won't be attacked. And I just want to underscore how perverse that is. People should be able to vote safely by any legal means that we allow. Forcing people to go vote in person because they are worried about the election's results being challenged is itself incredibly unfair, and really burdening people's exercise of the franchise in ways that are completely inappropriate. So this is a really difficult challenge. The election administrators who are dealing with voting by mail, are facing a whole series of concerns about how to address the misinformation that's out there that are in some ways are very parallel to the ones that public health officials are facing on COVID. This is an ongoing challenge when elites are repeatedly amplifying false claims that you're trying to counter, and when they're doing so in ways that are clearly unsupported, but also, have huge reach to the public and can drown out whatever it is that you're trying to say.
There have been concerns about election-related misinformation proliferating on social media platforms in the period directly following Election Day. So let's link this back to the prior conversation we were having. Are these legitimate concerns?
Very much so. I think we need to worry a lot about misinformation on Election Day itself, that evening, and in the days following if the result is not immediately apparent. I was a member of a committee that issued a report on how to protect the legitimacy of the election. And we identified this period while the votes are being counted as being one where misinformation is a particularly dangerous threat. It's a time when people are used to the result being known on the night of the election, but there's nothing legally required about that. And it's quite possible we won't know the result for days or even weeks, depending on how close the election is and how many mail ballots are cast. Election officials are trying to get ready for the expected deluge of mail ballots so that that count can proceed more quickly. But in that period, there may be a kind of informational void where we see the margin changing as those mail ballots are counted, and there isn't much news that's filling in that void about exactly what's happening. That's exactly the context where we should worry about election-related misinformation, claims of widespread fraud, claims that the election is being stolen. It's a very dangerous time. Democracies depend on the peaceful transfer of power. We need every American to understand that the election is being conducted fairly and that the result reflects the actual intentions of voters. That period from when the count starts until the final enough votes are known that a winner can be ascertained is a time when misinformation could thrive. And it's going to be really important for the media in particular to prepare the public for that moment and to report responsibly during it.
And just to clarify, that includes a responsibility on the part of social media platforms.
Oh, absolutely. And I forgot to talk about social media. So let me add to that. They are creating policies around attacks on the integrity of the election prior to voting, and then false claims about the outcome of the election afterward. So they are very much preparing for this moment, and they're classifying those false claims about the outcome of the election as a kind of harmful misinformation because it endangers the legitimacy of our democratic process. Just like false claims about how or when to vote endanger people's ability to participate before the election. So I think those policies are being created. It's a very difficult and dangerous issue, though, because the social media companies are, again, balancing their role as information providers and their role as potential amplifiers of misinformation. The president says something that is news. Should the platform companies remove everything he says that is false or misleading? That's a principle of living in a free society. But at the same time, some of these claims are potentially so harmful, they may feel compelled to take action. So how to strike that balance is not at all clear. And there are many statements that are made that people have different views about. And I think it's going to be an ongoing challenge.
So can proliferation of misinformation actually be powerful enough to incite violence? Have we seen cases of that?
It's a risk and a concern. I certainly didn't think widespread political violence was a threat I would be worried about in the United States when I was doing my training in graduate school, for instance. But we've seen in other countries social media rumors inspiring violence. Here in this country, I would say the record of that is less clear, but there are worries that if people are being told that the election is in the process of being stolen, they might be moved to take action. And even if that's a fraction of 1% of people who are exposed to that message, or even just a small handful, we are a heavily armed society, and we've seen in many different kinds of cases what a few extremists can do if inspired to take action. So I do think there's reason to worry and to prepare to the extent possible to try to address that threat.
So do the same strategies you talked about for combating COVID-related misinformation work or make sense for combating election-related misinformation?
I think so. In many cases, the platforms are using the same kinds of approaches. They're labeling statements from public figures that they don't feel like they can take down, or they're removing posts that directly violate rules against especially harmful kinds of misinformation, such as false claims about when or how to vote, or false claims about cures or treatments for COVID-19. So I do think those approaches can be successful in both cases. But both cases, again, the platforms struggle with the gray areas where, on the one hand, we have really serious concerns about misinformation in both of these domains. On the other hand, we should have serious concerns about how much control the platforms are potentially exercising over the free flow of information in our political debate. I'm not sure people will look back on this time and think it was great that we gave so much power de facto to a handful of private companies over what we see and hear about politics. It's a really difficult question.
Okay, last question. When we spoke last spring in the initial pandemic lockdown period, we touched on this question of whether and how misinformation might strain the fabric of our democracy. I want to end by returning to this big question. Is proliferation of misinformation a threat to American democracy?
I think it is. The threat in the United States is significant. I'm one of the organizers of a group called Brightline Watch that monitors the state of U.S. democracy. The experts we survey in the United States rate the quality of democracy in this country as having significantly deteriorated since prior to when President Trump took office. In that context, we now face an election that is whose legitimacy is under attack in a way we've never seen before, where a president is directly challenging the legitimacy of the election process using misinformation in a country where there's already a significant threat of democratic erosion. I think that's a really difficult challenge for American democracy, and one that every American should take seriously. I've called it a democratic emergency, and I stand by those words. The peaceful transfer of power is core to democracy itself. That depends on people accepting the legitimacy of the results and willingly turning over power to the other side. The misinformation that we're being exposed to and the subsequent misinformation to come may undermine that compact. It may be a kind of soft target. We've never seen the losing side attack the legitimacy of the process in such a direct and fundamental way before. And that's poisonous for democracy. It's really dangerous. And we face these dual threats of this raging pandemic and a democracy that's struggling to conduct the fundamentals of our system of government. It's a really challenging time.
Brendan, thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Public Health on Call is produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Lamari Morales. Audio production by Spencer Greer, Niall Owen McCusker, Cian Oates, and Matthew Martin, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Thank you for listening.